Hello, welcome to the Urban Manifesto. We are at the cusp of great changes for better or worse. This is a time of reinvention. We have to reimagine and redraw, and we need to build back better out of this crisis. In the Urban Manifesto series, we are outlining this bold new vision for our urban futures. We are so thrilled to bring this series to you in partnership with the Architecture Foundation, and we're part of the 100-day studio that they have been hosting all through the last few weeks. I'm Pratima Manohar from the Urban Vision, and I co-host this series with my colleague Lucy Bullivant. Lucy?
Hello, everybody. Once again, we're here in this place. I'm so happy to see you all again. Today's theme is environmental sustainability strategies. And I'm delighted to welcome two splendid guests, Tara Gbolade, architect and co-founder, Gbolade Design Studio London, and Julian Marwitz, business developer, Urbanomy Berlin. Good to see you both, Tara and Julian.
Good to see you.
Yeah, in the face of the myriad environmental challenges that cities are facing, from climate change to pollution, health deprivation, and destruction of biodiversity, to name some of the key elements, the most advanced political and business leaders and practitioners are proactive in addressing the various systemic challenges through innovative adaptations and both incremental and disruptive change. They're on this course to try and build economies that redistribute social and environmental goals and transform cities into low-carbon, high-quality places where people can live healthily and fulfill their life goals. Now, enabling sustainable cities requires multi-scalar cross-sector rethinking of spatial planning, urban infrastructure and utilities, materials, buildings, lifestyles, and governance structures. Now, where Tara and I each live in the UK, the inclusive umbrella definition by government of local carbon environmental goods and services, which are activities spread across many existing sectors like transport, construction, energy, but with a common purpose to reduce environmental impact. The field is better known these days. Firms dedicated to these goals still really need greater recognition and investment. And this is a growth area for employment as well in a huge way, I think, and many other people agree with this. And this is apparently one of the fastest growing industrial sectors globally. However, the impacts of sustainability and resilience measures are clearly unevenly distributed across the world at this point. And due to the urgency, rising to the challenges, both locally and more widely, simply cannot be postponed despite the pandemic crisis. Now, this crisis has seen heroic support efforts by local governments, care sectors, and many businesses. So how can this focus on precious care for people's lives and communities continue through holistic, sustainable strategies as we transition into a new era? So today we'll really look forward to hearing what Tara and Julian each feel is essential, possible and promising in terms of progress in sustainability strategies across the board. But first, to ask you, how have you each been managing during the lockdown?
I'll go first. It's really interesting actually during the lockdown, because initially when it started, I guess none of us expected we'd be in this for as long as we have been. So initially it seemed fine. Obviously, as time has gone on, it is dragging a bit, and we like many other practices, I'm sure, will be looking to slowly go back to the office and go back to working in an office space. However, I think it's clear that things will not be as normal as we were prior to lockdown, and I'm looking forward to and excited about what that future looks like.
Very good. And how about you, Julian?
myself, I'm based in Germany, and I was actually when it happened back at the place of my parents. So it gave me the opportunity to spend a lot of quality time with family, which was super nice, but also super lucky in that sense, because normally I was traveling that much that you could have ended up in a place where it's not as pleasant to spend a long while. So in that case, it was good. And then you could have also more time spending time in nature, and we focus on important topics, because especially when you live in these fast-moving times, it might be that you lose focus sometimes. And I think for every one of us, that has been a very, very good exercise to reshape our priorities. But definitely the human contact is missing at some point, and I think every one of us feeling it at some point, that the personal meetings cannot adequately replace the online meetings cannot adequately replace anything where you're sitting face to face.
I totally, utterly agree with you. I hear you. Thank you very much. So let's now we come to the first segment of the episode, where we invite a 3-point manifesto, urban manifesto, from each of you. Tara, will you go first, please? Thanks.
Yes, of course, happy to. So I guess my 3 points focus on this. The first one is a focus on the environmental sustainability. So really specifically looking at high quality design in housing. As many of you, as we are on this side, we'll be watching this from home, and we've spent a lot of time at home. It's given us the opportunity, hopefully, to address what home looks like and rethink perhaps what home might do in the future. Certainly what it's done for people like me who live in a flat in London is it's refocused me on the quality that will need to significantly increase as our behaviors change, and as we tend to probably spend more time at home post-pandemic and post-pandemic, I guess, to a degree. I'm sure many of us won't necessarily feel the need to traipse into the center of a city. For me, that's London. And so I'll be spending far more time at home. And so therefore, really looking at how existing and new buildings will need to respond in varying but significant ways, specifically towards becoming net zero, if we're serious about creating healthy places to live and work. And the final point on environmental sustainability is that it's important that we use this opportunity to recognize that targeting higher standards will address many other societal inequalities, including fuel poverty, respiratory diseases like asthma, and cleaner air quality. My second point would be a focus on the wider socioeconomic sustainability issues, such as social value. Here, greater emphasis will need to be placed on our public realm, in effect, because we're going to be using them differently. Understanding the powerful role sustainable categories such as sustainable movements, so active travel, walking, cycling, green infrastructure, clean air quality, social gathering spaces, the impact that these will now have on amenities post-pandemic, but really a stronger socioeconomic emphasis on how our future will unfold. This allows us to look at items such as health and well-being, ensuring our foods are locally grown, and free exercises, for example, in parks, community engagements leading to a feeling of belonging, social infrastructure, how local cafes and independent stores can be supported, and finally bringing back our ability to really live intergenerationally and multi-generationally with each other. And my third and final point is a focus on our local high streets. What you see on the screen here is Purley High Street, with a scheme which we're working on. The role and the purpose of the high street must be addressed. Of course, we know that it's changing as our high street, or it has changed over the last 3 to 4 months, speeding up the inevitable of change that was already occurring on our high streets. But based on the above points I've made on environmental and socioeconomic sustainability, successful high streets will be those where they can enable change quickly. They'll now look like destinations rather than what has happened to a lot of high streets, acting as a thoroughway. We can look at ideas really about pedestrianizing high streets again, so we allow and encourage local residents to stay and linger the ease of enabling change of uses, for example. Looking at smaller co-working spaces that could be dotted around suburbs rather than in the city. And then finally, our opportunity, I guess, to enable each other and enable our high streets by supporting local and independent businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Julian.
Yes, sure. Happy to.
So
I think it will be quite an interesting change within the urbanization, because as everyone knows, urbanization is a huge process at the moment. You will find more than the majority of people living in cities soon. But Corona or COVID could have really changed the picture a little bit. So it might be that rural areas are becoming more popular again, because so far that hasn't been the case for nearly every country. Obviously, a city was always a magnet and attraction for opportunities, for culture, for business, for talent and innovation. So people needed to move there. But now I think it's beginning more that people are trying to make a proper calculation in terms of what are the costs and disadvantages also, which you're taking into account for that. And I think in that case, obviously, the resiliency of a city is much less, rather than being in a rural context. And it's more safe to be in the nature environment in small places. So density will be avoided probably. And then I guess also sometimes people will really make the calculation in terms of what are the rental costs, what are the living costs in a city, which in nearly every country are always higher than countryside. So to see a revival of people moving back to these villages, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, you have seen it before, especially from families, also in the London context, when it was too expensive to create a family properly within London. So a lot of people moved outside of London and did the typical commute. And this is true for several places. But that was only relevant to a certain group of people. And I think nowadays you will see more and more who will think about the trade-off, especially also in terms of jobs, because before jobs were bound to be in a certain office in a certain place, and now several jobs at least can be done also remote. So this transition, I think, could become quite an interesting area, and also all the consequences which are linked with that in terms of urban planning, mobility issues, which have to be taken into account and which maybe sometimes have to be replanned, because before everyone was thinking about larger urban areas, and now it can become a different way in that. As a second thought, the proximity of daily needs within the city should be closer. I think we are getting a little bit more spoiled in that way, or we expect that we have very short distances. So it's a very rational behavior that we want to have everything that we need in this very short realm. And that again is a huge challenge for some parts of the city, because sometimes just residential areas have been planned, and it's quite a wide distance to hospitals, to schools, to the supermarkets. So I think in general the people nowadays they want to spend not that much time in commuting somewhere, and they want to reduce mobility. First of all, because it's annoying, but now even more, I think COVID is playing a role, and you don't want to spend that much time in mobility unless it is completely on your own. But when you think about all the shared economy and also the public transport, that's obviously a risk for getting COVID. But not only that, I think even before it was true that you could have become also any kind of infection there as well. So the risk will be obviously much more minimized when you can get all your daily needs in a very close area. So again, I think that's a big challenge to redesign places in that way, that it should be guaranteed that you don't have to cover these long distances. And then on the other hand, it will mean for some mobility companies or some mobility tools to really shrink down its demand. And that will be quite interesting. And then the third thought for the Urban Manifesto is that local public places are becoming more significant, a little bit similar as to Tara's point with the environment. I think people will really focus more on the local community. Before, it was very interesting to explore all kind of trendy places in the city, but especially with COVID, people tend to not be that mobile anymore, not that flexible in terms of changing locations. So it's a revival that you actually want to feel comfortable in your own area. You want to make contacts maybe with your neighbors, with your local community. You want to have events going on there. You want to have trust. So the core values which are normally relevant to a village will probably become a much more significant role also within the urban context.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I mean, combining both your and Tara's insights, it's a pretty thoroughgoing, holistic overall reassessment of people's life priorities, translated into real, genuine physical and systemic adaptations. And obviously, one of the big questions is whether the impetus will stay in the medium and the long term. And I think it also, a lot of the points that you've made do relate very closely to Prathima's first question, which she will now ask you.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Tara and Julian, for sharing those, agenda for the future. And it's actually really nice to have an architect and planner, as well as an investor and someone from the business community outline this agenda. I was mentioning to all of you that recent op-ed in The Economist reminded us that watching this pandemic is almost like a preview to the other big crisis that we are all facing, which is the climate crisis. Neither this virus nor the climate change, crisis is going to care very much about borders. Our world is deeply interconnected. So the risks that we will face with climate change won't be defined within boundaries. So in a way, it'll demand a similar kind of action and response from our governments that we've hardly ever seen in peacetime. The kind of response to battling these pandemic that we are seeing across the world has been, a dramatic shift, and we need to see that kind of response even to the climate change crisis, because scientists have warned about similar health crisis as well as freak weather events that can emerge from climate change. And while all of us recognize that integrating climate goals into the recovery plan can be a compelling driver for a long-term success, how do you both see the pandemic affecting sustainable architecture and construction in the medium term? Tara?
Thank you. I think that if it does nothing else, what it's done is accelerate its need, or our need for much higher quality building, our need for much higher public spaces as well. I think based on, and the exciting thing, so just maybe linking your point of the fact that the pandemic and the climate crisis has no borders. I think the exciting thing is to be able to see how we have to collaborate with each other, and yes, at government level, but also critically at grassroots level, and ideas that are coming forth in Sweden can be explored here, because now we're far more in tune of how we can all work together, or how we need to all work together. to ensure we meet our common goals. Of course, we have the goal of carbon neutral by 2050 or net zero carbon by 2050, and many authorities, certainly in the UK, have gone further and asked for or made a commitment to becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And while we still define these in different ways, the truth of the matter is that we're all moving in one direction, and now it's just bringing everybody else along that journey.
Julian, what are the immediate impacts of this pandemic on the world of climate change, especially construction and built environment?
Yeah, I think definitely topics like well-being are very important. So when you think about these well-being certificates, I think that will be an interesting one, because so far we are more used for value a building according to its price, obviously, first of all, for investors, and then maybe also for its environmental impact in some cases with LEED or other certifications. But nowadays, probably people want to have also well-being certificates as well, because employees and probably even on the investment funds will ask for it. So I think it can even come down to small technical measures, as in terms of how is the ventilation system constructed. I mean, especially in terms of infections, the HVAC system is playing a vital role for that. So whenever you can do that more in a clever way, I think that is very important. And then on the more global level, or more on the political cooperation, I think resiliency committees are becoming an urgent need, because what we saw from COVID really is that there was no real measure in place. So a normal business has always its continuity plan, right? And that was not feeling that the countries had this response. Everyone was testing it out in a different way, and some were more successful, less successful in that way, but there was not a clear pathway. And I think it should, this experience with COVID should help us actually learn that we should have an adequate response for climate change, because otherwise we're getting in a much more dramatic situation where much more lives are actually affected when we face all the consequences of climate change, especially related to flooding. So we would need more committees working on plans how to react upon it or prevent it. And I think on that front, there's not that much done so far. So we have a lot of initiatives to reduce carbon emissions, which is very good, but there's not as much on resiliency when you're thinking about proper flood dams for cities, for example. In my experience, there hasn't been done that much, and also the private sector has to do more, because it's a little bit like the same from an investment perspective with the corporate cure. Because people are obviously jumping on that opportunity now, and it's a huge, interesting investment opportunity for pharmaceuticals. But the same will also be for the whole sector regarding to sustainability and construction and resiliency measures. Because once we have the problem in terms of actual flooding or other consequences from climate change, people have to react upon that, and then it has to be very quick. And then you see huge transactions in that space.
So, thank you for both those points. I think the message from both of you is that we will see scaling up of investments around well-being and health, especially in the built environment. And I think that's a great link to make to connect to the citizens. Because often climate change sounds so wonkish and technical and scientific. People don't get the connection to their own life. So I think driving home that message of well-being is crucial as we talk about sustainability. Lucy?
Yeah, and I think that leads very neatly on to the confronting the reality that if we look more closely at buildings as structures, they account for nearly 40% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. So the question, as we've addressed already, we've started looking into is, how do we meet the net zero whole life carbon for new and retrofitted buildings by 2030? Now, Tara, not Cara. Tara is a certified passive house designer, aren't you? Passive house being the leading international design standard for low energy, comfortable, high quality, affordable buildings. So one associated question with this big how question is, does passive house remain as pertinent as ever before? And then Julian, the related question to the achieving of the target and how we go about it is, how are you personally going about achieving optimum energy performance in your work in building construction? So if Tara can answer first, then we move to Julian. Thanks.
Yes, I think that's a brilliant question, and I'd have to say, as a designer, a passive house designer, I'd have to say yes. And it's what we turn to champion with clients that we work with, but also I work in local authority as well. And I think it's encouraging to see that many more local authorities are starting to turn towards a building standard such as passive house, which, like you highlighted, is the highest standard that we have at the moment. And the advantage of something like passive house or a standard like passive house is that there's a lot of emphasis in the way we design on adopting a fabric first approach. So really this concept of reducing energy use in the first place is what's critical, and therefore vastly reducing our operational energy. I think we are waking up as an industry to spending a lot more time on embodied carbon as well. And I think there are ways to go still with that. So really looking at the energy that's used, so from manufacturing prior to practical completion on site, and seeing how we can reduce that along the way. So looking at aspects such as waste and the circular economy as well, but also design for manufacture or off-site construction as well, or contributing to these ways in which we can vastly reduce embodied carbon as well. But I think having standards like passive house and really thinking about our embodied carbon allow us to really look at whole life carbon. And so therefore we're starting to, with standards like passive house, starting to get to the ambitions of becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And so I strongly believe in that and encourage it wherever possible.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And I think adding to that, it's also more important that we are really focusing more on the materials itself, because in the past it has been quite a typical thing to think about the consumers. How can they reduce energy consumption, and then also what kind of help you can put with tools for that. But I think when you look into the whole process in terms of climate change, obviously every action of us is counting, and even more, unfortunately, is the production of the material. So still, concrete is cement is accounting for the biggest part of the CO2 emission. So when we can optimize that process, that would definitely help more towards achieving the goal. So there are more solutions out there now who are coming up with concrete solutions in cement, which has less air inside, for example, and also the product, also the process itself, how to produce cement has been done much better these days, because often the majority of it was just waste, basically, and then in the end you tested it out a lot, and then you had the perfect product, and that should obviously be in a better way. Now we have the adequate testing for that. So I think in general, the innovation in material science is absolutely absolutely essential for achieving that goal. And then on top of it, you can obviously then also trying to reduce the own carbon footprint with all kind of different appliances. But the construction itself is unfortunately still very carbon heavy, so that has to be reduced. And it's quite interesting also to look back in former construction when you think about history or other countries where it is not as modern as we understand it, but there are very interesting ways how we did in a more sustainable way. And you can even learn these days from animals as well. When you think about termite cities, they did it in a very sustainable way. And that's probably something in which pathway we have to steer more into.
Observation that we should be looking at termite cities as well. I mean, within the context of what you both are addressing, which is to actually analyze and be very, very careful in optimizing processes. So focusing on the best possible processes at this point in terms of achieving social value, which is something increasing numbers of our local authorities, certainly in the UK, have recognised in their declaration of a climate emergency. It's not just making that declaration that there is a climate emergency because it's, after all, in the newspapers, but the really, really strong, enlightened, concrete series of steps and measures and standards that they can implement and follow to actually follow up on such a statement. So yeah, I think that again moves us forward into the next question, which is Prathima's one.
Yeah, if you kind of think about the bigger environmental debate across the world, you all of you are in Europe, where you are the vanguards of sustainability in many ways. All of us around the world kind of strive to be like Europe in the way, not just in terms of built environment, but even in terms of urbanism, with a focus on walkability, mass transit, and biking. So, but globally, the environmental debate is often presented as a zero-sum game, where the ideas of economic growth versus environmental degradation, protection is kind of pitted against each other. In that view, I mean, Tara, the first question is to you. Many people in economies like ours, and maybe even in the States where I worked extensively, take for granted that the green building movement, green buildings in general, cost more money than regular buildings that they're building. Do you find that to be the case?
Yes, I still think that's, sorry, not in action, but I still find that we're having a lot of these conversations in terms of when you bring up, certainly linked to environmental sustainability, when you bring up standards such as passive house, the first thing that everybody jumps to is cost. And I think that needs to be looked at, again, in two ways. One is a matter of scale. So yes, when you're building a single dwelling, into building regulation standards, which is at all not sufficient at the moment, when you're comparing that to building a passive house that has increased insulation, has an MVHR system incorporated in it, has undertaken stringent air tests. Of course, there are additional costs to bear at that domestic and very individual scale, which can always and usually be offset and looked at in the long term as just capital cost versus the operational costs. And when you're looking at paying your energy bills at, $1,200 per annum to $120 per annum, that's a significant saving that you can spend going on extra holidays, not by flying, obviously, not kidding. So there's that, but then also the economies of scale in when we're scaling up from the single domestic to 100 homes or 200 homes, and with the build campaign on at the moment, very much so, particularly with new buildings, that the costs actually level out, and it's the same net costs that you'd be using anyway when it comes to scale, because you have that advantage there. So I think it's important that it's looked at in context when we're talking about high standards. And passive house, for example, is just one standard as well of of which there are others. But I think that cost scare needs to be balanced out and needs to be challenged and needs to be explored in a little bit more detail.
No, I agree with you, Tara. Think about life cycle costs of running and maintaining and operating the building, and not just the construction cost. Yeah, that's a great point. Julian, we still live in the whole world of finance where the world uses financial metrics to be the most important to measure success or failure. How do we make social and environmental impacts and the triple bottom line also very critical when we review some of these projects?
I think the challenge so far, especially in real estate, was, and it's even more these days, it's a very preferential investment area. So people love to invest into real estate, but this is actually bad for the passive housing, because what it means is that people can gain so much high margins on the transaction in the end that the operating costs are not that relevant anymore. So you can basically sometimes sell your building with such a high percentage on top that the actual gained value which you can get out of the savings is not as important, which is obviously the wrong calculation, because as Tara completely rightly said, like you should think about it long term. But if you're selling a building quite quickly after 5 or 10 years, then obviously the transaction value is more important. I think therefore we have to come really to an understanding that we should also think financially more sustainable, and I guess at some point the increase of real estate will come down to a lower value again, and you see it already in certain markets. So whenever that happens, the operational costs are becoming more critical, plus when you're thinking from a long term. So when you're an investor who is thinking at least about 15 or 20 years time of holding a property, then obviously operations are becoming very important. And then these measures exactly can play a very vital role. And then it has to be taken into account also on a typical calculation sheet.
Thank you. I think those are important points to think about, because at the end of the day, it's the economy and financial models that drive development more than anything. So, to kind of highlight points of longer term savings is very critical. Lucy?
Yeah, so to move on and explore 2 other dimensions of your personal professional spheres. One of the most, certainly to my mind, one of the most fascinating and worthy new developments in the UK, in the southeast, is Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, one of a number of so-called garden towns, not to be recreated in the spirit of Ebenezer Howard to the nth degree, but definitely styled for the 21st century and its social, economic and environmental needs. So Tara, you have been leading the sustainability guidance for Harlow and Gilston Garden Town. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're going about achieving this, the so-called triple bottom line sustainability ambitions for the development there?
Yes, I think this is, it's one of the most, I think you set it up quite perfectly. It's one of the most exciting jobs I feel in the country. And I'm working with one of the most exciting teams as well on it. So I feel very, very lucky actually to be working on this. And the sustainability guidance really sort of builds upon the ambition that exists within the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town. We have quite a strong vision and a strong design guide where we're trying to encourage people in and around Harlow to be able to live as sustainably as possible. And that means, in terms of work, play, just living, enjoying life with each other. And so that forms, to have such ambition actually forms the base, on top of which last year the 5 partner authorities involved, including Hertfordshire and Essex County Councils and the district councils, which include Epping Forest, East Herts, and Harlow. And to one degree or another, they all declared climate emergency last year as well, with an overall commitment to becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And so what's this again also sort of lays the foundation, and what we felt was critical was that this sustainability guidance really placed value on environmental as much as socioeconomic sustainability within new developments. So across the Garden Town, we're expecting circa 23,000 over the next 20 plus years, which means it's important to get the policy and foundations right at this stage, as a lot of them are in early master planning stage. So for what I get the opportunity to do really is writing quite a robust environmental and socioeconomic sustainability guidance, which means that each new development that comes into the Garden Town will be assessed on the checklist of guidance that we're writing at the moment. And really the ambition, of course, is to promote high quality design in terms of fabric first standards that we've just been discussing here, but very much about green infrastructure, recognizing the co-benefits of having green infrastructure in new places, sustainable movements, ensuring that active travel, so walking, cycling is by default the easiest way to get around, looking at air pollution, of course, and water efficiency, but then with the socioeconomic section, really looking at how we embed and expand upon health and well-being, as I think Julian highlighted earlier, but also stakeholder engagement and how we ensure that communities feel engaged throughout the process of new developments coming through. So the opportunity, I guess, to sort of knit the existing communities and new communities quite well is it's really exciting. I could go on and on, so I'll stop.
We'll have to do a whole episode on this project. Slightly when it's further advanced. Yeah, amazing. Thank you. So, Julian, a very custom design question for you is, you've talked about certain energy efficient materials and technologies. Which ones, in your estimation, are really going to be big game changers for sustainability and resilience going over in the next decade? I mean, with your forecasting hat on.
So in my past, I have been dealing a lot with phase change material. I think that's very interesting. So in a nutshell, it's increasing the thermal mass of a building. It's basically reducing the consumption of either heating or cooling in quite a massive way. So these are salt crystals which are absorbing the temperature units in the room and then releasing them off constantly at the temperature level which you set it before. So typically 21 or 22 degrees. So whenever you have a rest of temperature in the room, the system can run automatically without any energy input. And I think these systems or others who are working in a similar way are really revolutionary, because finally you don't need to get any energy input anymore. Because, for example, when you're thinking about e-mobility, you still need electricity, obviously, and that's still a problem because you have to generate it somewhere. These solutions are completely passive, and you're basically mixing it in a chemical version. It's the same as concrete. Before we used to build more huge concrete buildings, it also was getting cooler there in summer, but obviously not in a very manageable way. So the phase change material can very much drill it down to the exact temperature level which you need. So perfect for logistics, for example. You store chocolate in a warehouse with 15 degrees constantly. With that solution, it's always putting down the temperature at that level and using the swings of day and night change. So in general, again, in terms of energy consumption, heating and cooling is still one of the large energy is one of the larger energy consumers. So when we can tackle that properly, that is definitely helping. And when you think about lighting with the LED lamps, which are now common, this is good, but it's having not such a huge impact. So you should really think logically about what normally is the biggest part of the electricity bill, and how can you reduce that in a significant way. And therefore we found back then in the past the solution to be very interesting.
And any particular materials as such? I know LED, well, obviously LED is a particular technique and involves materials, but any materials that come to mind?
Apart from the phase change material, really thinking more about cement. As I said before, when you're just in the initial construction phase, definitely everyone should screen the market and look if there is an adequate alternative to other solutions out there in the market who are more environmentally friendly.
Great. Thank you very much for your advice and the insight into Harlow and Gilston. So I think we're staying with buildings, aren't we, with the next question, Prathama?
No, I think we're talking about something a little bit more macro.
We are going to macro now again.
All my friends who are in finance and investor in the investment community have been constantly in every conversation that we've now had digitally been referring to unlimited quantitative easing. And I know this is outside the circles of finance, but this is a emergency monetary policy that central banks across the world are adopting to print endless amounts of currency to increase money supply and liquidity in the market. Because a crisis like this, when you've had an economic full stop, if the financial markets go into a kind of stale spin, the road to recovery will be so much more tougher. So all of them refer to unlimited quantitative easing as unlimited risk in our future. But we know that in the past, most governments have invested massive amounts of money to recover from crises like this. And if we think about this huge amount of capital that will be invested in our economy as the road to recovery, and if we can think about that as an opportunity towards decarbonizing the economy, and if we can imagine a world of energy transition out of that huge amount of investment that we will see post the pandemic, if we can kind of futurecast a little bit, it'd be nice to get policy ideas from both of you to incentivize implementation of large-scale sustainability in cities and built environment. We've to imagine where all that money has to go. So why can't it be in sustainability? How do we enable that, Tara?
Good question. Maybe a few key points for me. One is, first, a lot of, certainly in the UK, a lot of authorities have declared a climate emergency. So I think what's next really is really defining and committing to this, because it's one thing making a declaration, it's another thing, a whole other thing is refining at the moment, really expanding what exactly that means. So being ambitious, I guess, or we're in a moment where we have an opportunity to really be ambitious and push for the most stringent and the best standards that are necessary for buildings, for our infrastructure, in terms of highways, but also social infrastructure, etc. So really committing, in effect, is what I'm saying to that net zero carbon declaration. The second is really as LPAs acting as enablers to ensure net zero carbon developments could go ahead or should be championed. And that, I think, could include incentives, and incentives really looking at de-risking the process for developers and applicants as well, de-risking the process for residents, whether that looks like de-risking in terms of the actual planning process, whether that might lead to a sped up planning process, for example, and that's because of the type of sustainability policy that exists within the authorities, because schemes will be assessed in similar ways, so that section can be moved on quite quickly. But also looking at actively promoting commercial or rather construction gain. So in terms of really championing, I guess it's no longer innovative, but we still have to say, because it's not yet common, but off-site construction and MMC and design for manufacture and assembly, really promoting that, so that we can promote this concept of completing work quicker, and therefore giving developers that construction certainty. And then I guess looking really at de-risking the commercial aspect for developers as well. So whether that looks like local authorities and policy actively encouraging entering competitions, either local or national or international, because of the high quality work, local authorities being enablers of that process, having their own, for example, local awards, and being able to host really good quality work on their websites, for example. So therefore giving a signal to residents in a new area, for example, that these are high quality developers. I think once we start really looking at how we work collaboratively with developers to be able to de-risk the process from planning through to commercialization, we start to really use policy and collaboration in a strong way. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Tara. And I want to quickly take a moment to say hello to the amazing community from the Architecture Foundation, Urbanista, and the Urban Vision that joins us every week. We have a few comments here from our audience as well. We have Les Moore, who's the chair at Permaculture Association. So, he says he's designing a global balcony network to address these issues. So, we'd love to hear more about that. But if you have any questions for our speakers, please comment in the video box below, and we'll make sure they can answer some of them. And please hit the like button if you're on Facebook, and hit the subscribe button if you're on YouTube, so you can stay in touch with our programming. Julian, going back to the question that I asked before, about the road to recovery and sustainability, you work extensively within the investment community in the world of capital. So what's the view from that community at this point in time in terms of sustainability? Do you see them taking on that agenda, or what kind of policies and enabling environment governments can create to make sustainability the bedrock of the recovery plan?
Yeah, so I think in all kinds of investments, and even if it's on a very small personal level, the risk is always a dominating factor. And sustainability so far has been an area which is obviously completely new and therefore more risky. So in the past, there haven't been that many investors who completely embraced it. There was a huge interest always, but mostly very, very risky investors got into the space, or especially someone who felt more responsible. So when you think about family offices, new generation members, and the next generation basically was embracing that topic, and then trying out new solutions on that front. And that is slowly now coming. So there's more and more recognition and more activity on the field. And then obviously on this institutional level, ESG has been implemented in a lot of the choice of the different stocks. So that has been done in a quite coherent way. But what I think on the policy level, which is missing, is what I also said at the beginning. There has to be more resiliency towards the climate change, and so far governments have not dealt with that in a very efficient way. So I think when you're thinking from the pure mechanics of economics, it could be interesting to create a stronger competition. And in my vision, it would be ideally an international body who is distributing money, whoever that is, if it's the World Bank, where every country, or then broken it down, even every city has to compete to get these subventions. And you can only get it when you can demonstrate how much you have done for the environment in a certain way that you actually either reduce the carbon footprint, or you have already invested into resiliency measures at flood dams, for example. Because in the end, Pratima, as you rightly said, there is a huge cost for every economy whenever a catastrophe happens. And it's a little bit similar as to health as well, right? So it is much better to invest into prevention rather than to deal with the mess afterwards. So I think we have to definitely rethink our priorities towards investing more into prevention of some of the consequences of climate change. And normally every government or country is pushing back the responsibility to another one, because they think, oh, the catastrophe, the storm will just happen in another part of the country or in another country. So I think competition would be very helpful, and definitely also to take that into a very clear, precise calculation. So what kind of measures would have prevented how much loss of lives of human beings, destruction of buildings, destruction of infrastructure, because all of that, and especially on the material level, can be valued in a certain price. And if we can prevent that to happen, that should be definitely be rewarded, and that should be a return on investment. So when these measures will be supported more, there should be definitely be this big reward in the end. And then, as it always happens in economics, once the snowball effect of competition is starting, everyone wants to be better. And I think on that level, we can actually achieve much more.
You're right, Julian. I think we all have to now acknowledge that resilience is crucial to your survival and for your ability to thrive. I think this pandemic has demonstrated, the need for resilience and resilient cities, especially, as being a key denominator in your future success. So hopefully, whatever we do in the future will have that framework of resilience, especially the road to recovery plan and the huge amount of capital that's going to follow that. Hopefully, will invest in resilience. So we have only got comments and no questions from the community. So Lucy, do you have final question for?
Yeah, I've got a question on Julian's point about the concept of resilience competition. Out of interest, since I'm not aware of it, did that discussion? When did such a discussion originate? Did it come up at COP21 in Paris, the conference on climate change in Paris 5 years ago, which is considered as quite a kind of pivotal point, or has it come up more recently only in the highest echelons of economic circles, like at the World Economic Forum in Davos?
No, that is basically sharing a personal vision. So
sorry, it's your own idea. Great.
I was not relating to any government body, but yeah. I think it would be very helpful. And I think at the moment it is much more on a very high policy level, but it has not taken into account the mechanics of economics, because, as I said, the typical response from a government would be just reacting when it's too late, and everyone would wait until that stage. Then there are some who are more innovative, and they're taking the lead. But even that is not enough at the moment. As you can see, no one is reaching the COP21 targets. So I think if you get a different mechanism behind, that would definitely solve the issue more. But then again, it's very tricky, because when it comes down to distribute money in a certain way and to legitimize someone to have that power, that is obviously creating confusion and a lot of politics and discussions. But in an ideal world, I think there should be this entity with clear rules whenever you're achieving these and these measures, you can get some part of the cake. That would be something which I think would happen in a normal investor community. So when you're just thinking of distributing that in a certain way just from business, that would be something which would be ideal in that sense.
Okay. Have you written an article about this proposal of yours?
Not yet. It was just coming spontaneously to my mind.
We need one.
But I just have to highlight that the World Economic Forum has used that theme as the driver of their agenda for the coming year. It's called the Great Reset, and I think the founder of World Economic Forum is actually authoring a book on this, right? That the road to recovery should be, in a way, address the political, social, and environmental crisis that we are all facing across the world. And the road to recovery should acknowledge that, and we should look at this moment as the moment of great reset. So on that note, I want to thank Julian and Tara for joining this very, very important conversation. And I think there's an op-ed idea that can come out of this discussion as well. So thank you for this very meaningful conversation. And I want to thank our audience for joining us every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. BST. And, it's nice to see you every Tuesday, as we kind of outline the agenda for our collective future. Again, thanks to Architecture Foundation's 100-Day Studio for having embraced this series. So we're taking a little break next week, but we will be back the week after, which is 28th July, with a very interesting session on tactical urbanism with architect Alex Furens, who's based in... He's the founder of Ericsson Furnes Architects, right, Lucy?
That's right. Works in Norway, a Norwegian architect.
Yes, and his work is based on civic participation and architectural innovation. And we also will have Mike Liddon, who is the creator of the Open Streets project and the globally acclaimed tactical urbanism movement. And he authored that series on short-term action and long-term change on tactical urbanism. So it's going to be an interesting program. So please join us. That will be on 28th July. And thank you again for joining us today, and have a great day and great evening. Stay well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.